The gunshot that echoed through the canyon walls that October morning in 1878 wasn't meant for Martha Jean Holloway, but it changed her life forever. She had been riding her mare through the Red Rock passes near Park City, Utah, delivering medical supplies to the mining camps scattered throughout the Wasatch Mountains, when the bullet struck the cliff face above her head. Shards of sandstone rained down as her horse reared, and Martha gripped the reins with white knuckles, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below her, in a ravine thick with juniper trees, 3 men were shooting at a lone rider who was weaving between the rocks with practiced precision. Martha should have turned around. She should have spurred her horse back toward the safety of town, where her father ran the general store, and her mother waited with supper warming on the stove. But something about the desperate way that lone rider moved, about the uneven odds, about the cowardice of 3 against 1, made her reach for the Winchester rifle secured to her saddle. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, not for sport but for survival in a territory where law was often just a suggestion and justice was whatever you could carve out with your own 2 hands. She fired once into the air, the crack of her rifle sharp enough to make the 3 attackers pause and look up toward the ridge. In that moment of hesitation, the lone rider spurred his horse forward and disappeared into a narrow crevice between 2 towering rock formations. The 3 men looked at each other, then at Martha's silhouette against the morning sky, and seemed to decide that whatever bounty they were chasing wasn't worth dealing with a witness. They turned their horses and rode west, toward the desert basin beyond the mountains. Martha sat frozen for a long moment, her breath coming fast, watching the dust settle. She had just involved herself in something that was none of her business, and her practical nature warred with the racing excitement in her veins. The medical supplies in her saddlebags were expected at the Silver Queen mine by noon, but her curiosity pulled her down the rocky slope toward that crevice where the rider had vanished. She found him 20 minutes later, dismounted and checking his horse's legs for injury in a small hollow sheltered by ancient cottonwoods. He looked up at her approach, and Martha's first thought was that he had the most startling blue eyes she had ever seen, bright as the Utah sky and just as endless. His face was dusty and sun-weathered, his dark hair longer than fashion dictated, touching his collar beneath a black hat that had seen better days. He couldn't have been more than 25 or 26, perhaps 3 years older than herself. "You the one who fired that shot?" His voice was rough, probably from dust and exertion, but there was a musical quality underneath it that caught her attention. "I am." Martha kept her rifle across her saddle, not pointing at him but not put away either. Seemed like unfair odds, unfair for them maybe. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though his eyes remained cautious. "I'm grateful, though I'm wondering why a lady would risk herself for a stranger. I'm wondering why 3 men would chase one through dangerous terrain. Must be quite a story." He studied her for a moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "Name's Daniel Foster. Those men work for a rancher named Carmichael who thinks I stole some of his cattle. I didn't, but Carmichael doesn't much care about truth when he's already decided on his version of events." Martha had heard the name Carmichael before. Marcus Carmichael owned the sprawling Double C ranch that covered thousands of acres north of Park City, and his reputation was as large as his holdings. He was known for being ruthless with anyone he perceived as a threat, and the territorial law enforcement was too stretched thin to pay much attention to disputes between ranchers and drifters. If you didn't steal his cattle, who did? Now that's the question, isn't it? Daniel Foster patted his horse's neck, satisfied that the animal was sound. "I've got my suspicions, but suspicions don't mean much without proof." And I'm more interested in staying alive long enough to gather that proof than I am in explaining myself to every good Samaritan who crosses my path. No offense intended, none taken. Martha made a decision that her mother would have scolded her for. I'm Martha Jean Holloway. My father runs the general store in Park City. If you need supplies or a place to lay low for a while, we have a storage barn behind the store. It's not much, but it's shelter. Daniel Foster looked at her with undisguised surprise. Why would you offer that? You don't know me from Adam. I know you didn't shoot back at me when you could have. I know 3 men were chasing you and you didn't try to grab me as a hostage when I came down here. That's enough for now. She adjusted her grip on her reins, suddenly feeling foolish under his intense gaze. The offer stands if you want it. I have to get these supplies to the Silver Queen mine, but I'll be back in town by evening. She didn't wait for his answer, just turned her mare and headed back up the slope toward the trail. Her heart was still racing, but now she couldn't tell if it was from the danger or from something else entirely. Something about the way Daniel Foster had looked at her like he was seeing straight through to the core of who she was. The ride to the Silver Queen mine took 2 hours, winding through narrow paths that overlooked steep drops where the mountain fell away into shadow. Martha had made this journey dozens of times since taking over the delivery route from her older brother when he moved to California the previous spring. She knew every turn, every loose stone, every place where you had to dismount and lead your horse carefully around a blind corner. The mine foreman, a gruff Cornishman named Thomas Webb, accepted the supplies with his usual grunt of acknowledgement and paid her in silver coins that she tucked into the leather pouch at her belt. Heard shooting this morning, Webb said as she prepared to leave. Up in the high country. You see anything? Some men chasing someone, didn't get close enough to see who. The lie came easily, though Martha wasn't typically a dishonest person. But something made her protect Daniel Foster's identity, some instinct she didn't fully understand. Webb nodded, his weathered face skeptical but not pressing. Carmichael's been making noise about rustlers again. Lost maybe 30 head last month or so he claims. Personally, I think he just miscounted and doesn't want to admit it. Martha filed this information away as she rode back toward Park City. The afternoon sun was hot on her shoulders, and she stopped once to water her horse at a creek that ran cold and clear from the mountain snowmelt. She found herself thinking about Daniel Foster more than was probably wise, about the way he moved with an easy confidence despite being outnumbered, about that glimpse of humor in his eyes even in dangerous circumstances. By the time she reached Park City, the sun was dropping toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the wooden buildings lining Main Street. Park City had grown rapidly in the past few years, as silver strikes brought prospectors and miners flooding into the Wasatch Mountains. What had been a small Mormon settlement was now a bustling town of nearly 2,000 people, with more arriving every week. Saloons and gambling halls stood next to churches and schoolhouses in the peculiar democracy of boom towns, where everyone was trying to make their fortune and yesterday's failures could become tomorrow's success stories. The Holloway General Store occupied a prime corner lot near the center of town, a 2-story building with the store on the ground floor and the family's living quarters above. Martha's father, Samuel Holloway, was serving a customer when she entered through the back door, so she quietly stabled her mare and carried the payment from the mine inside to add to the ledger. Her mother, Rebecca, was preparing supper in the kitchen, the smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread making Martha suddenly aware of how hungry she was. How was the ride, dear? Uneventful. Another lie, but Martha justified it by telling herself she would explain everything once she decided what everything was. The mine foreman sends his regards. That old grouch, I doubt he sends anyone regards. But Rebecca smiled as she said it, her hands busy with biscuit dough. Your father wants to talk to you after supper about extending the delivery routes. There's a new camp opening up near the Weber River that will need regular supplies. They ate as a family once Samuel closed the store for the evening, the conversation revolving around business matters and town gossip. A new family had arrived from Missouri, looking to start a dairy farm. The mayor was pushing for a proper telegraph office. Someone had seen a grizzly bear near the South Pass, which meant hunters would be out trying to claim the bounty. Normal topics, the ordinary rhythm of life in a frontier town, but Martha found her mind wandering to the storage barn and whether Daniel Foster would actually take her up on her offer. She had her answer an hour after sunset when she went out to check on her horse one final time before bed. The barn was dark except for the moonlight filtering through gaps in the wood planking, but she could make out the silhouette of a second horse in one of the empty stalls. She lit a lantern and found Daniel Foster sitting on a pile of feed sacks, his saddle and bedroll arranged to make a rough camp. "Didn't think you'd come," Martha said quietly, mindful of not being overheard from the house. "Didn't think I would either. But those men doubled back and picked up my trail again, and I figured a barn was safer than sleeping in the open." He stood up, his tall frame unfolding with a fluid grace. "I can pay for the accommodation. Not much, but something. Keep your money. Just tell me the truth about what's going on." Daniel Foster studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. About 2 months ago, I was working as a hired hand on a small ranch east of here, owned by a man named Peter Sutton. Good man, honest. He'd built that ranch up from nothing over 15 years. Then Carmichael decided he wanted Sutton's water rights, made him an offer that was basically robbery. When Sutton refused, suddenly cattle started disappearing from Carmichael's ranch, and Carmichael started telling everyone that Sutton was running a rustling operation. Was he? No. Sutton wouldn't steal breath from a dying man, much less cattle. But Carmichael's got influence, and he got the territorial marshal to investigate. Nothing came of it because there was no evidence, but the damage was done. People started avoiding Sutton's ranch, wouldn't do business with him. Then one night, Carmichael's men rode in and burned Sutton's barn to the ground. Sutton tried to fight the fire, got caught in the collapse. Daniel's voice went flat, emotionless in the way of someone holding back grief. He died 2 days later from his injuries, never regained consciousness. Martha felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening. And you think Carmichael is still rustling his own cattle to blame it on someone else? I think Carmichael found a way to get rid of competition and acquire land at the same time. Sutton's widow had to sell the ranch for next to nothing, couldn't maintain it alone. Guess who bought it? Carmichael. Got it in one. And now I'm the inconvenient witness who worked for Sutton and knows the whole story. Carmichael would prefer I disappeared, preferably in a way that looks like justice being served on a cattle thief. Daniel sat back down on the feed sacks, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. I've been trying to gather evidence, something concrete enough to take to the territorial authorities in Salt Lake City. But it's dangerous work, and I'm running out of time. Martha should have asked him to leave. She should have recognized that harboring someone accused of rustling, even falsely accused, could bring trouble down on her family's business. But looking at Daniel Foster's face in the lamplight, seeing the determination and decency there, she found herself saying, "What kind of evidence are you looking for? Proof that Carmichael's men are the ones actually stealing the cattle?" I've been watching his ranch when I can, trying to catch them in the act, but it's a big spread, and I'm just one person." He looked at her directly, and again Martha felt that sensation of being truly seen. "You should stay out of this, Miss Holloway. I'm grateful for the shelter, but I won't have your family caught up in my troubles. Little late for that, since you're in our barn." Martha set the lantern on a barrel and crossed her arms. "Besides, I know this territory better than most. I ride through these mountains several times a week making deliveries. If Carmichael's men are moving stolen cattle, I might spot something you wouldn't. It's dangerous. Everything worth doing usually is." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm tired of just delivering supplies and keeping ledgers. Maybe it's time I did something that mattered." Daniel Foster looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just shook his head with something that might have been admiration. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Holloway. Most interesting people are both. Get some rest. Tomorrow I'll bring you breakfast before my father opens the store, and we can figure out a plan." She left him there in the barn with the lantern turned low, and made her way back to the house with her mind spinning. She had just committed herself to helping a wanted man investigate a powerful rancher, and she should have been terrified. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in months, maybe years. The routine of her life in Park City had been comfortable but confining, and now suddenly the world had cracked open to reveal possibilities she hadn't known existed. Sleep was long in coming that night, and when it did, her dreams were full of blue eyes and distant gunshots. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with autumn beginning to paint the mountainsides in gold and crimson. Martha rose before her parents, dressed quietly, and slipped down to the kitchen to pack a breakfast of bread, cheese, and cold chicken. She added a jar of her mother's preserves and a canteen of water, then carried everything out to the barn in a basket covered with a cloth. Daniel was already awake, grooming his horse with careful attention. He looked up when she entered, and Martha noticed that he'd cleaned up as best he could, his face less dusty though still showing the dark stubble of a few days without shaving. "Brought food," she said, setting the basket on the feed barrel. "You'll need your strength if we're going to be playing detective." "We're not playing anything." But his protest was weakened by the hungry way he looked at the basket. "This is real danger, Miss Holloway. Carmichael doesn't make idle threats, Martha. If we're going to be partners in crime fighting, you might as well use my given name." She watched as he unpacked the breakfast and took a bite of bread with an appreciative sound. "And I understand the danger. I'm not naive, Mr. Foster. Daniel. And I'm starting to see that you're definitely not naive." He ate quickly but neatly, the manners of someone who'd been raised properly even if current circumstances were rough. "So what's your plan?" Martha had been thinking about this half the night. "The Double C Ranch is too big to watch all at once, like you said. But if Carmichael's men are rustling cattle and making it look like someone else did it, they need to move those cattle somewhere. Can't just make 30 head disappear into thin air. So there must be a holding area, somewhere off the main ranch where they keep the stolen cattle before they rebrand them or sell them." "That's what I've been thinking too, but Carmichael owns so much land, finding one hidden corral could take weeks. Unless you know where the old line shacks are. The ones from before Carmichael bought up all his neighbors." Martha leaned against the barn wall, thinking out loud. "My father's been selling supplies in this area for 20 years. He knows every old homestead, every abandoned building in these mountains. Some of those line shacks are on what's now Carmichael's land, but they're remote enough that he probably doesn't even remember they exist." Daniel's eyes lit up with understanding. "And a forgotten line shack would be the perfect place to hide stolen cattle temporarily." "Exactly. I'll talk to my father this morning, casual-like, ask him about the old homesteads for a school project or something. He won't think twice about it. Then we can narrow down the most likely locations and check them out. You're good at this. Daniel finished the last of the breakfast and wiped his hands on his pants. Ever think about becoming a Pinkerton detective? Women can't be Pinkertons. We're considered too delicate for such work. Martha's tone was dry. Never mind that we run households, birth babies, and survive everything the frontier throws at us. But investigating crimes, that's apparently beyond our capabilities. Clearly, those Pinkerton men have never met you. There was warmth in Daniel's voice, and Martha felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. She covered it by turning to check on her horse, buying herself a moment to compose her thoughts. I need to get back inside before my mother starts wondering where I am. I'll come back this evening with whatever information I can gather. She paused at the barn door. And Daniel, be careful if you leave the barn today. Carmichael's men might have connections in town. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Got a book in my saddlebag and plenty of thinking to keep me occupied. He smiled, and Martha noticed the way it transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely striking. Thank you, Martha, for all of this. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried back to the house as the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern peaks. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Martha helped in the store, measuring out flour and sugar, cutting fabric, tallying accounts in the ledger. She waited until early afternoon when her father was in a good mood after closing a large sale to the mine company, before she approached him with her fabricated story about needing information for a historical society project. Samuel Holloway was happy to oblige, pulling out an old surveyor's map and marking the locations of various abandoned homesteads. This one here was the old Patterson place, gave up after 2 bad winters in the early 60s. This one belonged to a fellow named Chen who tried to run sheep, but the cattlemen drove him out. Real shame, that was. And these 3 up in the high country were line shacks for various small ranches, most of which got bought up by Carmichael or went bust during the Panic of '73. Martha committed the locations to memory, though she also carefully traced them onto a piece of paper under the pretense of making notes. 5 possibilities, scattered across an area of maybe 50 square miles. It would still take time to check them all, but it was better than searching blindly. That evening, after supper and after her parents had retired to their bedroom, Martha slipped out to the barn once more. Daniel was studying his own map by lamplight, and she spread her father's map beside it so they could compare. "This one," Daniel said, pointing to a location in the northeastern section. "It's closest to where I saw some of Carmichael's men riding about a week ago. They were moving fast, like they had a purpose. That's the old Patterson homestead. My father says it's been empty for more than 15 years. Martha traced the trails leading to the location. I could ride out there tomorrow. I'm supposed to make a delivery to the Northern Star mine, and this is only a few miles out of the way. I should be the one checking it out. You should be the one staying hidden. Carmichael's men know your face. They don't know mine, and even if they see me, I've got a legitimate reason for being in the area." Martha met his gaze steadily. "Let me do this part, Daniel. You can't do everything alone." He looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "Just be careful. If you see anyone there right away, don't try to be a hero. I'll be careful, I promise." She started to roll up her father's map, then paused. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When this is over, when we've cleared your name and dealt with Carmichael, what will you do? Where will you go?" He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the rough wood of the barrel where the lamp sat. "I don't rightly know. I've been drifting since I was 17, working ranches from Montana to Texas. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Seemed easier that way, not getting attached to places or people. That sounds lonely. It is. He looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Martha's breath catch. But lately, I've been thinking maybe I'm tired of lonely. Maybe I'm ready for something different. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities, until Martha forced herself to break eye contact and finish rolling up the map. I should go. Early start tomorrow, Martha. He stood up as she turned to leave. Thank you for believing me when you have no real reason to. That means more than you know. I'm a good judge of character, she said softly, and I know you're telling the truth. I can feel it. She left before he could respond, her heart beating too fast, her skin flushed despite the cool night air. She was falling for Daniel Foster, she realized with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. Falling for a man she'd known less than 2 days, a man who might ride away forever once this business was settled. It was foolish and impractical and completely unlike her usual careful nature. And she didn't want to stop. The ride to the Northern Star mine the next morning took Martha through some of the most beautiful country in the territory, following a creek that wound between stands of aspen trees that shimmered gold in the morning light. She made her delivery efficiently, then turned her mare northeast toward the location her father had marked as the Patterson homestead. The land grew rougher as she climbed higher, the trail narrowing to little more than a deer path in places. She kept alert for any signs of recent passage, looking for horse tracks or broken branches that would indicate riders had come through recently. About an hour into her detour, she found what she was looking for. Fresh tracks, probably from yesterday or the day before, leading toward a canyon that cut between 2 ridges. Martha dismounted and led her horse quietly, using the trees for cover as she approached the canyon mouth. She could smell wood smoke before she saw anything else, and her pulse quickened. Someone was definitely here, and they were being cautious about it since the homestead itself was hidden from casual view. She tied her horse to a tree branch well back from the canyon and continued on foot, moving as quietly as her father had taught her when they used to hunt deer together. The canyon opened into a small valley, maybe 3 acres of relatively flat ground with good grass and a stream running through it. The old Patterson cabin stood at one end, its roof partially collapsed, but the walls still standing. And in a makeshift corral behind the cabin were approximately 25 cattle, all bearing fresh brands that looked suspiciously new. 2 men sat by a campfire near the cabin, rifles within easy reach. Martha didn't recognize them, but their rough appearance and careful positioning suggested they were guards rather than legitimate ranch hands. She crept closer, using a jumble of boulders for cover, trying to hear their conversation. How much longer we got to babysit these cows? One of them complained, getting tired of sitting out here in the middle of nowhere. Boss says 2 more days, then we drive them to the railroad yard in Heber and sell them to that buyer from Denver. Once they're loaded on the train, nobody can prove where they came from. The second man spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Then we get paid and you can go spend your money however you want. Still don't see why we had to kill Sutton. Could have just scared him off. Sutton knew too much, and he wasn't the scaring type. Besides, boss wants that water rights access. This whole setup worked out perfect. We get rid of competition, make some extra money selling the boss's own cattle back to him after we recover them from rustlers, and boss gets to expand his territory. Everybody wins. Except Sutton. Except Sutton, the second man agreed with a laugh. Martha felt cold fury wash through her at their casual discussion of murder and theft. These were the men responsible for Peter Sutton's death, and they were talking about it like it was just another business transaction. She needed to get back to town, needed to tell Daniel what she'd heard, needed to figure out how to get this testimony to the authorities. She began backing away carefully, keeping the boulders between herself and the two men. She had nearly made it back to the trees when her boot came down on a loose stone that skittered away with a sound that seemed loud as gunfire in the quiet mountain air. What was that? One of the men was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Martha ran. She crashed through the underbrush with abandon now, speed more important than stealth. Behind her, she heard shouts and the sound of men giving chase. She reached her horse, jerked the reins free, and swung into the saddle in one fluid motion born of years of practice. The mare responded to her urgency, leaping into a gallop as the first gunshot cracked through the air. Martha bent low over her horse's neck, urging every bit of speed from the animal as they raced back down the trail. More shots followed, but shooting accurately at a moving target from distance was nearly impossible, and the bullets went wide. She didn't slow down until she was well clear of the canyon, back among the familiar trails she knew by heart. Her hands were shaking when she finally allowed the mare to slow to a walk. That had been close, too close. But she had the information they needed: location, number of cattle, names of buyers in Heber, and most importantly, a confession of murder. The question now was what to do with it. She rode hard back to Park City, arriving in mid-afternoon with her horse lathered and her own nerves stretched thin. She went straight to the barn, not even stopping at the house, and found Daniel working on repairing a broken saddle strap. "I found them," she said without preamble. "The cattle, the men guarding them, everything. And Daniel, I heard them talking. They admitted to killing Peter Sutton. They said Carmichael ordered it." Daniel stood up slowly, his face going hard. "Tell me everything." Martha recounted the whole story, from finding the hidden valley to overhearing the conversation to her narrow escape. Daniel listened without interrupting, his jaw clenched tighter with each detail. 2 days, he said when she finished. "We've got 2 days before they move those cattle to Heber and sell them. Once that happens, the evidence disappears. We need to get the law involved. A real marshal, not the local deputy who's probably in Carmichael's pocket." Martha paced the barn floor, thinking. Salt Lake City is the nearest place with federal marshals who might actually investigate. That's 2 days hard riding there and back, assuming we could even get someone to listen. Daniel shook his head. "And we still don't have proof that would hold up in court. Just your word against Carmichael's men, and no offense, but a woman's testimony isn't always given the same weight as a man's." The unfairness of that statement made Martha angry, but she knew he was right. The territorial justice system was imperfect at best and corrupt at worst, and it heavily favored men of property and influence like Marcus Carmichael. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through options. "We need to catch them in the act. If we can get multiple witnesses to see Carmichael's men moving those stolen cattle, ideally respectable citizens who can testify, then it becomes harder to dismiss or cover up." "The miners," Martha said suddenly. "The mine foremen, the shift supervisors. Most of them are honest men who don't have any connection to Carmichael. If we could get several of them to witness the cattle being moved, their testimony would carry weight. That could work. We need to know exactly when they're planning to move the herd and which route they'll take to Heber." Daniel started pacing too, the two of them circling each other in the barn like planets in orbit. "The question is how to arrange it without tipping off Carmichael's men that they're walking into a trap." They spent the next hour working out the details of a plan that was risky and complicated, and depended on several things going right simultaneously. Martha would ride back out to the canyon tomorrow morning, this time staying well hidden, to confirm the cattle were still there and to watch for signs that the men were preparing to move them. Daniel would remain in town and discreetly contact some of the mine foremen, men he'd met during his time working various jobs in the territory, and explain the situation. If we can get 4 or 5 solid witnesses positioned along the trail to Heber, and if we can get word to the territorial marshal's office in Salt Lake City about what's happening, then even Carmichael won't be able to talk his way out of it, Daniel said. That's a lot of ifs. It's all we've got. He caught her hand as she moved past him, stopping her mid-pace. Martha, you don't have to do this. You've already done more than anyone had a right to ask. If something goes wrong tomorrow, if those men catch you again, they won't. She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. I'll be careful, I promise. And this needs to end, Daniel. Peter Sutton deserves justice, and Carmichael needs to answer for what he's done. You're remarkable, you know that. Daniel's voice was soft, his blue eyes searching her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. I've never met anyone like you. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. You haven't known me very long. Maybe I'm not as remarkable as you think. I know enough. He raised his free hand and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his touch feather-light. I know you're brave and smart and kind. I know you see injustice and you do something about it instead of just looking away. I know that when you smile, it's like sunrise over the mountains. Daniel. His name came out as barely a whisper. I know this is the worst possible timing, he continued. I know I'm a wanted man with no prospects and no real future to offer anyone. But Martha, I need you to know that when this is over, however it turns out, I'm going to ask your father for permission to court you properly. And I hope you'll say yes. For a moment, Martha couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except the way Daniel was looking at her and the wild hope rising in her chest. Then she smiled, slow and genuine. I'll say yes, but only if you promise to stay alive long enough to ask. Deal? He grinned, and the expression transformed him, made him look younger and less careworn. For just a moment, she could see who he might have been without the weight of injustice and hardship bearing down on him. They stood there in the barn with the afternoon light slanting through the cracks in the walls, hands clasped, something new and fragile and precious growing between them. Then Martha heard her mother calling from the house, and reality reasserted itself. I have to go, she said reluctantly. But tomorrow, Daniel, tomorrow we end this. Tomorrow, he agreed. That night, Martha barely slept again, but this time it was anticipation rather than worry that kept her awake. She lay in her narrow bed and thought about Daniel's words, about the promise of a future she hadn't known she wanted until suddenly it was right there in front of her, close enough to touch. She had always assumed she would eventually marry some local merchant or mine supervisor, have a respectable life that looked much like her mother's. But now she imagined something different, a life with a man who saw her as an equal partner, who valued her courage and intelligence, who made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced before. She also thought about the danger they would face tomorrow. If anything went wrong, if Carmichael's men caught on to their plan, people could die. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her, but she didn't waver in her resolve. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Dawn came cold and clear, with frost on the ground that would melt as soon as the sun rose above the peaks. Martha dressed in her warmest riding clothes and packed supplies for a long day of watching and waiting. She stopped by the barn before leaving and found Daniel already awake, checking his rifle and pistol with methodical care. I talked to 3 of the mine foremen yesterday evening, he he told her. Thomas Webb from Silver Queen, Patrick O'Brien from Northern Star, and James Chen from the Lucky Strike Mine. They all knew Peter Sutton, and they all agreed to help. They'll be positioned along the trail to Heber by noon today, close enough to observe but hidden. If the cattle move, they'll see it. And the marshal? I sent a telegram last night from the office before it closed, explained the situation and gave the location of the hidden valley. Even if we can't catch them in the act, at least there's a record now with the authorities. Daniel checked the cylinder of his revolver one more time, then holstered it. I'm going with you today. Daniel, that's too risky if Carmichael's men see you. If Carmichael's men catch you alone, you'll need backup. I'm coming, and that's final. His tone left no room for argument. We'll stay well hidden, but I need to be there, Martha. I need to see this through. She wanted to protest, wanted to keep him safe in the barn where Carmichael couldn't touch him, but she also understood his need to face this directly, to confront the injustice that had upended his life. So she nodded, and together, they saddled their horses in the pre-dawn darkness. They rode out of Park City separately, Daniel leaving first and Martha following 20 minutes later to avoid anyone noticing they were together. The rendezvous point was a distinctive rock formation about halfway to the canyon, shaped like a ship's prow jutting out from the mountainside. Daniel was waiting when Martha arrived, and they continued together through country that was slowly waking up for the day. Birds called in the pine trees, and twice they saw deer moving through the underbrush. The mountains were beautiful in the early morning, all purple shadows and golden light, and Martha felt a pang at the thought that they were riding toward potential violence in the midst of such peace. They reached the canyon by mid-morning and found a vantage point on the ridge above, sheltered by trees and boulders, with a clear view down into the hidden valley. The cattle were still there, grazing peacefully, and Martha counted 3 men this time instead of 2. Carmichael must have sent reinforcements. There, Daniel whispered, pointing toward the canyon entrance. 2 more riders coming in. They watched as the newcomers rode into the valley and dismounted near the cabin. One of them was a tall man with an expensive saddle and silver conchos on his hatband, clearly someone of authority. Even from a distance, Martha could read the deference in the way the other men approached him. That's Carmichael, Daniel breathed. Marcus Carmichael himself. They were too far away to hear conversation, but the body language was clear enough. Carmichael was giving orders, gesturing toward the cattle and then toward the canyon mouth. The men began moving with purpose, saddling horses and preparing to move the herd. They're going early, Martha said. They're not waiting the 2 days, which means someone tipped them off or Carmichael got spooked. Daniel's jaw clenched. We need to get word to the mine foreman, let them know the cattle are moving now. But before they could retreat to their horses, more riders appeared at the canyon entrance. 6 men, all armed, all wearing deputy badges that glinted in the sunlight. Martha's heart leaped with hope. They had gotten the marshal's attention faster than expected, until she saw the way Carmichael greeted the newcomers with easy familiarity. Those aren't real deputies, she whispered. Or if they are, they're working for Carmichael. Either way, we're in trouble. Daniel pulled her down lower behind the rocks as one of the riders scanned the ridge. They're probably here to escort the cattle to Heber, make it look official if anyone questions the herd moving through. They watched helplessly as Carmichael's men began driving the cattle out of the valley, the false deputies riding alongside in a formation that looked deceptively official. It was a brilliant move, actually. Who would question cattle being moved under deputy supervision? Even the mine foreman Martha and Daniel had positioned as witnesses would have a hard time proving anything illegal was happening. What do we do? Martha asked. Daniel's expression was grim. We follow them. And we hope that Webb and the others are smart enough to realize something's wrong and get word to the real authorities. They gave the group a several-minute head start, then mounted and began trailing them at a careful distance. The terrain worked in their favor, with plenty of cover and multiple parallel trails that allowed them to stay out of sight while keeping the herd in view. But it was nerve-wracking work, knowing that discovery would likely mean death. The morning stretched into afternoon as they followed the slow-moving cattle through the mountain passes. Martha's mare was steady and sure-footed, and she was grateful for the countless hours she'd spent in the saddle, learning to read the land and move quietly through it. Daniel rode like he was part of his horse, fluid and alert, his attention constantly scanning for threats. They were maybe 5 miles from Heber when everything went wrong. One of the rear guards broke away from the group and rode back along the trail, clearly checking for followers. Martha and Daniel barely had time to dismount and pull their horses into a thick stand of pine trees before the man rode past, so close they could have reached out and touched him. The guard paused, looking around with narrowed eyes. His horse shifted nervously, sensing the other animals nearby. Martha held her breath, one hand on her mare's muzzle to keep the animal quiet, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it could be heard. After what felt like an eternity, the guard shook his head and turned back toward the herd. But he had barely gone 20 yards when Martha's horse, nervous from the tension, whinnied softly. It was barely a sound, but in the quiet mountain air it carried. The guard spun his horse around, his hand going to his rifle. "Who's there? Show yourself." Daniel stepped out from the trees, his hands held low and empty, his voice calm. "Just a couple of travelers, friend. Didn't mean to startle you. Travelers on a remote trail hiding in the trees. Don't think so." The guard brought his rifle up, not quite pointing it but ready. "You two better come with me. Boss will want to talk to you." "That's not going to happen." Daniel's tone remained easy, conversational, but Martha saw his weight shift slightly, saw the way his right hand drifted closer to his holster. "We're just going to get on our horses and head back to Park City. No trouble for anyone. I don't think you understand the situation, friend." The guard's finger moved to his rifle's trigger. "You come peaceful or you come tied across your saddle. Your choice." What happened next occurred so fast that Martha almost couldn't follow it. Daniel's hand flashed to his gun, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The shot took the guard in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around in his saddle. His horse reared, and the man fell heavily to the ground. "Mount up," Daniel shouted to Martha as the sound of the gunshot echoed through the canyon, alerting the men ahead. "Ride." They swung into their saddles and took off at a gallop, not back toward Park City but forward toward the herd. It was a calculated gamble. Carmichael's men would expect them to run away, not toward the confrontation. If they could reach Heber ahead of the group, get to the real law enforcement before Carmichael could spin his version of events, they might still have a chance. Behind them, they heard shouting and more gunfire, shots going wild as the men tried to hit moving targets at range. Martha bent low over her mare's neck, trusting the horse to find footing on the treacherous trail. Beside her, Daniel rode with reckless speed, his face set in determined lines. They burst out of the trees onto a wider trail, the kind used by freight wagons, and suddenly they could see Heber Valley spread out below them, the small town visible in the distance. They also saw riders coming up the trail from town, 4 men on horseback moving at a steady pace. "There," Daniel pointed. "That's Marshal Hendricks. I recognize him from when I tried to report Carmichael in Salt Lake City last month. He didn't believe me then, but maybe seeing this will change his mind." They rode straight for the marshal's group, with Carmichael's false deputies in pursuit. It must have been quite a sight. 2 riders racing down the mountain, followed by several armed men, all heading for a federal marshal who had just ridden up from town. "Marshal Hendricks," Daniel shouted as they drew close. "Those men are transporting stolen cattle under false pretenses. They're working for Marcus Carmichael, the marshal, a grizzled man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense bearing, held up a hand to stop his deputies from drawing their weapons. Daniel Foster, thought you'd left the territory." "I'm trying not to get killed long enough to prove my innocence, sir." Daniel reined in his horse, breathing hard. "Carmichael's been rustling his own cattle and framing others for it. We found the hidden herd and heard his men confessing to murder. They're moving the cattle to Heber right now with fake deputies as escort." Carmichael's men had caught up by then, their leader pulling up short when he saw the real marshal. "Don't listen to him, Marshal Hendricks. Foster's a known rustler. We've been tracking this stolen herd and we're bringing them in for evidence." "Is that so?" Marshal Hendricks looked between the two groups with the air of a man who had heard every possible lie in his career. "And who exactly are you deputized by?" "Deputy Branch, appointed by the Territorial Governor's office to assist in cattle theft investigations." The man produced a badge that looked official enough. "Interesting, seeing as I just came from the governor's office and they didn't mention any special appointments." The marshal's voice was dry. "Also interesting that I received a telegram last night from Park City detailing allegations against Marcus Carmichael, and now here you are with a convenient story about rustlers." Deputy Branch's face darkened. "We're on official business, Marshal. I'd appreciate if you didn't interfere. And I'd appreciate if you didn't lie to a federal officer." Hendricks signaled to his men, who drew their weapons. "All of you drop your guns, slowly." For a tense moment, Martha thought Carmichael's men might actually try to fight their way out. But they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and slowly, reluctantly, they complied with the marshal's orders. "Now then," Hendricks said once Carmichael's men were disarmed and being secured with rope by his deputies, "why don't you two tell me the whole story from the beginning? And I mean everything." They did. Right there on the trail with the afternoon sun beating down and the stolen cattle milling nervously in the distance, Martha and Daniel recounted everything from Peter Sutton's death to the hidden valley to the overheard confessions. Marshal Hendricks listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively grimmer. "That's a serious accusation," he said when they finished. "You're claiming that Marcus Carmichael, one of the most prominent ranchers in the territory, has been running a criminal operation for months." "It's not a claim, it's the truth," Daniel said firmly, "and we have witnesses. 3 mine foremen were positioned along the trail today, watching specifically to see if the cattle were moved. They can corroborate our story." "We'll see about that." The marshal looked at Martha. "And you, Miss Holloway, Martha Jean Holloway. My father runs the general store in Park City." Samuel Holloway's daughter, Hendricks's expression softened slightly. "I know your father. Good man, honest businessman. He'd vouch for you, he would, sir, though he doesn't know I've been involved in all this. I'd rather not worry him until it's resolved." "Smart woman." The marshal turned to one of his deputies. "Ride back to town and send telegrams to the territorial governor and to the sheriff's office in Park City. We need more men out here to secure this scene and to bring in Carmichael for questioning. Also find a veterinarian to check those cattle for evidence of brand tampering." As the deputy rode off, Hendricks looked back at Daniel. "You realize that even if everything you've said is true, you're still in a difficult position, Foster. You've been accused of rustling, you're on the run, and you just shot one of Carmichael's men. In self-defense, sir. He was going to shoot us. So you say. But that's going to need to be sorted out in a proper court." The marshal's tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. I'm going to have to hold you in custody until we can convene a hearing, for your own protection as much as anything. If Carmichael really is as dangerous as you claim, you're safer in a jail cell than on the run." Martha's heart sank, even though she knew the marshal was probably right. "How long will that take?" "Few days, maybe a week, depending on how fast we can gather evidence and witnesses." Hendricks looked at her kindly. "I know you want to help him, Miss Holloway. Best way to do that now is to get your father to hire Foster a good lawyer and to make sure those mine foremen give their statements to my office." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. More lawmen arrived from Heber, along with a veterinarian who confirmed that the brands on the cattle had been recently and clumsily altered. The mine foremen came in from their hiding places and gave statements supporting Martha and Daniel's account. Carmichael himself was brought in from his ranch, protesting loudly about wrongful harassment, but his bluster faded when faced with the mounting evidence. Through it all, Martha stayed close to Daniel, unwilling to leave his side until the last possible moment. When Marshal Hendricks finally said it was time to take Daniel to the jail in Heber for holding, she walked with them to the edge of town. "I'll get you the best lawyer we can find," she promised Daniel, "and I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened. I know you will." Daniel managed a smile despite the handcuffs on his wrists. "Martha, I meant what I said yesterday. When this is over, I want a chance at a real life. A life with you in it if you'll have me." "I will," she said softly, not caring that the marshal and his deputies could hear. "I absolutely will." The wait was agonizing. True to her word, Martha convinced her father to hire a lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Elizabeth Morrison, who had recently moved to Utah from San Francisco and was making a name for herself defending unpopular causes. Her mother was scandalized at first when Martha explained what had been happening, but her father just looked at his daughter with something like pride. "You've got your grandmother's spirit," Samuel Holloway said. "She once stared down a claim jumper with nothing but a rolling pin and sheer determination. Seems like that kind of courage runs in the family." The preliminary hearing took place 5 days later in the territorial courthouse in Salt Lake City. Martha sat in the gallery with her parents, her hands clenched in her lap, as Elizabeth Morrison methodically dismantled Carmichael's defense. The mine foremen testified about what they had witnessed. The veterinarian presented evidence of brand tampering. The wounded guard, faced with potential charges of attempted murder, turned state's evidence and confirmed that Carmichael had ordered Peter Sutton's death. By the end of the second day, Carmichael had been charged with murder, rustling, fraud, and conspiracy. His false deputies were also arrested, their badges revealed to be forgeries. And Daniel Foster was exonerated of all charges, the judge apologizing for the miscarriage of justice he had endured. Martha was waiting outside the courthouse when Daniel emerged, blinking in the bright November sunlight. He looked thinner than he had a week ago, his face marked by worry and poor sleep. But when he saw her, his whole expression transformed with joy. She ran to him, propriety forgotten, and he caught her in his arms and spun her around like she weighed nothing. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's finally over." "It's over," she agreed. "Martha." Daniel took her hand, suddenly serious. "I need to do this properly. I need to talk to your father." "He's right inside, probably talking to Elizabeth Morrison about the bill." "Then let's not keep him waiting." Samuel Holloway listened gravely as Daniel, hat in hand and voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, asked for permission to court his daughter. Martha held her breath, though she was reasonably certain her father would agree. He had seen how Daniel's exoneration had affected her, had noticed the way she had haunted the telegraph office waiting for news, had observed the care she took in selecting which preserves and baked goods to send to the jail through official channels. "You've got no property, no job, and you've just come through a serious legal battle," Samuel said. "Not what most fathers would consider ideal circumstances for a suitor." "No, sir, it's not," Daniel agreed, "but I'm a hard worker and I'm honest. I'll build something worth having, I promise you that, and I'll spend every day making sure your daughter knows she made the right choice." Samuel looked at his daughter, who met his gaze steadily, her chin raised in silent challenge. Then he smiled. "My daughter has a good head on her shoulders and a kind heart. If she thinks you're worth the risk, then I trust her judgment. You have my permission, Daniel Foster, but hurt her, and you'll answer to me and my wife both." "Understood, sir. Thank you." The courting period that followed was both proper and passionate, a balance of respecting social conventions while exploring the deep connection between them. Daniel found work as a ranch hand on a small but respectable spread owned by a man who believed in his innocence. He saved every penny he could while spending his free time in Park City, walking with Martha through the town, talking for hours about everything and nothing. They discovered shared loves of literature and music, both having been raised by parents who valued education despite frontier hardships. Daniel had a beautiful singing voice, rich and warm, and sometimes in the evenings he would sing old ballads while Martha listened with her heart in her throat. They debated politics and philosophy, argued playfully about whether horses or dogs made better companions, and slowly built a foundation of friendship beneath the attraction that had sparked between them from the start. Winter came to the mountains, bringing snow that turned Park City into a wonderland of white peaks and crystalline air. Daniel taught Martha to ice skate on a frozen pond outside town, and she taught him her mother's recipe for apple pie. They celebrated Christmas with both families, an occasion that proved somewhat awkward when Rebecca Holloway made pointed comments about the importance of proper engagements and not rushing into things. But Martha knew what she wanted, and in early March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the greening of the valley, Daniel asked her to marry him. Not with a ring, which he couldn't yet afford, but with a promise carved into a piece of smooth river stone: forever. She said yes without hesitation, and they planned a June wedding that would give Daniel time to save enough money for a small home. Marcus Carmichael was convicted in April and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His ranch was sold to pay restitution to Peter Sutton's widow and to cover the legal costs of his prosecution. Martha attended the sentencing with Daniel, wanting to see justice fully served, and she felt no satisfaction but rather a quiet relief when the judge pronounced sentence. This chapter of their lives could finally close. The wedding took place on a brilliant June afternoon in 1879, almost exactly 8 months after that first gunshot in the canyon had changed both their lives. The ceremony was held in the small church in Park City, with half the town in attendance and mine foremen serving as groomsmen. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Daniel had picked himself from the mountain meadows. When they exchanged vows, Daniel's voice was steady and sure, his blue eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her feel like they were the only two people in the world. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. The celebration afterward was held at the general store, with tables set up in the street and music provided by a fiddle player from the Lucky Strike mine. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, someone called for the groom to sing. Daniel laughed and protested, but Martha squeezed his hand and whispered, "Please." So he borrowed the fiddle player's guitar and stood in the middle of the crowd, Martha sitting on a chair nearby where she could watch him. He tuned the strings carefully, then began to play a gentle melody she had never heard before. "I wrote this a few months back," Daniel said, his eyes finding Martha's. "Didn't really know what to do with it. Figured maybe I'd sing it someday when the moment was right. Seems like this moment is about as right as it gets." He began to sing, and Martha felt tears spring to her eyes as she recognized herself in every verse. The song told the story of a cowboy lost in darkness who found light in an unexpected place, of a woman brave enough to stand up for justice, of two souls finding each other against impossible odds. The lyrics were simple but heartfelt, painting images of mountain sunrises and starlit rides, of hands clasped in trust, of love that grew from respect and admiration into something unshakable. The chorus spoke of a ballad sung by firelight, of words written in a heart before they ever touched paper, of a promise made beneath endless skies. And as Daniel sang the final verse, about building a life together in the wild beauty of the frontier, Martha realized that every word was for her, about her, a declaration of love wrapped in melody. When the last note faded, there was a moment of profound silence. Then the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Martha barely heard them. She stood and walked to Daniel, not caring who was watching, and kissed him with all the love and joy flooding through her. "That was beautiful," she whispered against his lips. "You're beautiful," he whispered back. "And you're mine. And you're mine." They left the celebration as the stars began to emerge overhead, riding together to the small cabin Daniel had built on a piece of land he'd purchased with his savings and a loan from Martha's father. It wasn't much yet, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs, the first home they would share. That night, lying in Daniel's arms with the sound of the wind in the pines outside their window, Martha reflected on the strange path that had brought them here. A gunshot in a canyon. A moment of decision to help a stranger, the slow unraveling of injustice and the even slower building of trust and love. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered honestly. "You?" "I spent years drifting, convinced I wasn't meant for anything permanent, thought maybe I was just broken somehow, unable to put down roots." He pulled her closer. "Then you rode into my life with a rifle and a brave heart, and suddenly everything made sense. Like I'd been waiting my whole life to find you." "We found each other," Martha corrected. "That's the important part." They talked long into the night, making plans for their future. Daniel wanted to expand their land eventually, maybe run cattle or horses. Martha wanted to continue her delivery work for her father's store, at least until children came along. They both wanted to travel someday, to see the ocean that neither had ever laid eyes on, to visit the cities back east that they'd only read about in books. But those were distant dreams. For now, they had this cabin, this moment, this love that had been tested by fire and proven true. The years that followed were filled with the kind of joy that comes from building something meaningful together. Daniel proved himself a skilled rancher, and within 3 years they had expanded their holdings to include a decent herd of cattle and several good horses. Martha continued her delivery routes until she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. And even then, she only stopped because Daniel and her father formed a rare united front in insisting she needed rest. Their son was born in February of 1882, during a blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Daniel delivered the baby himself with Martha's guidance, and they named him Peter Samuel Foster, honoring the man whose death had brought them together and the father who had supported their unconventional courtship. Young Peter had his mother's brown hair and his father's blue eyes, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was loved beyond measure. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Rebecca Ann. She had Martha's determination from the start, refusing to sleep unless someone was singing to her. Daniel spent many nights walking the cabin floor with his daughter in his arms, crooning the old ballads that had become a family tradition. Martha sometimes thought about that morning in the canyon, about the split-second decision that had changed everything. If she had turned around and ridden home instead of firing that warning shot, if she had chosen safety over courage, she would never have known this life. She would never have discovered the depth of love she was capable of feeling, never experienced the partnership of a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. By the spring of 1885, the Foster Ranch had become one of the most successful small operations in the territory. Daniel had earned a reputation for honesty and fair dealing, and their brand was respected throughout the region. Martha had started a small school in Park City, teaching children 3 days a week, while Daniel managed the ranch and their growing family. They had weathered financial hardships, including a brutal winter in 1883 that killed a quarter of their herd. They had faced down a claim jumper who tried to assert rights to part of their land, with Martha's detailed records and her father's testimony establishing their clear ownership. They had nursed each other through illnesses and celebrated each other's triumphs, and through it all, their love had only deepened. On their 6th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Martha back to the canyon where they had first met. They left the children with Rebecca Holloway for the day and rode out to that same ravine where 3 men had once chased a lone rider. The landscape hadn't changed much. The same red rocks and juniper trees, the same endless sky overhead. "I wanted to thank it," Daniel said as they stood at the canyon's edge. "This place. If those men hadn't been chasing me, if you hadn't been riding through at exactly that moment, we might never have met." "Fate?" Martha asked, teasing gently, "something like that. Or maybe just dumb luck." "Either way, I'm grateful." He pulled her close and she rested her head against his shoulder. "I love you, Martha Foster, more than I did on our wedding day, if that's even possible. It's possible. I love you more than I did yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." It was something she said often, a reminder that their love was not static but constantly growing, constantly evolving into something richer and deeper. They stayed in the canyon until sunset, talking and remembering, then rode home under emerging stars to the life they had built and the family waiting for them. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their children. Peter grew into a serious boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Rebecca was wilder, always climbing trees and asking questions that had no easy answers. In 1887, Martha gave birth to twins, boys they named Thomas and James, who brought chaos and laughter to the household in equal measure. Daniel's singing became legendary in Park City and the surrounding area. He was always asked to perform at weddings and community gatherings, and the ballad he had written for Martha on their wedding day was requested so often that other couples began adopting it as their own. But everyone knew the original inspiration, knew the story of the cowboy and the brave woman who had saved his life and won his heart. In 1890, Utah was working toward statehood, and the frontier that had defined their youth was slowly transforming into something more settled and civilized. Park City had grown from a rough mining town into a proper city with schools, churches, and even a small opera house. The Fosters were respected members of the community, known for their generosity and integrity. On a warm evening in late June of 1891, their 12th wedding anniversary, Daniel built a fire in the yard behind their house. now a substantial ranch home with 6 bedrooms and modern conveniences that would have seemed impossible in 1878. Their children were scattered around the yard, the younger ones playing tag while Peter and Rebecca helped their grandmother Rebecca Holloway set out desserts on a long table. Martha sat beside Daniel as he tuned his guitar, her hand resting comfortably on his knee. They had both aged, of course. Martha had lines at the corners of her eyes and silver beginning to thread through her brown hair. Daniel's dark hair was receding slightly at the temples, and he moved a bit more carefully after a fall from a horse the previous year had left him with a lingering ache in his back. But when he looked at her, Martha saw the same love and wonder that had been there on their wedding day, and when she looked at him, she felt the same surge of joy and gratitude that she had felt that first time he smiled at her in the barn. "Sing the ballad, Papa," young James called out. "Sing Mama's song, Daniel agreed, smiling at Martha. "Though I think it's become all of ours by now." He began to play, and the familiar melody drifted across the yard, bringing everyone to stillness. The children gathered around, even 10-year-old Peter putting aside his book to listen. Martha's parents stood by the dessert table, Samuel's arm around his wife's shoulders. And as Daniel sang about finding light in darkness, about courage and love and promises kept, Martha felt the story of their life together wash over her. The ballad ended, but the evening continued with more music and laughter and stories. Thomas Webb had been invited, along with Patrick O'Brien and James Chen, the mine foreman who had helped bring Carmichael to justice all those years ago. They shared memories of that day, though the fear and danger had long since faded, leaving only the satisfaction of justice served. Later, after the children had been put to bed and the guests had departed, Martha and Daniel sat alone by the dying fire. The night was clear and cool, perfect for sitting outside wrapped in blankets and watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if things had gone differently?" Martha asked. "If you'd never come to Utah, if Carmichael had never existed," Daniel considered this seriously. "I suppose I would have kept drifting. Probably would have ended up in California or maybe back in Texas where I was born. Would have worked ranches, saved some money, maybe eventually bought a small place of my own." He paused. "But I would have been alone, Martha. And I wouldn't have known what I was missing, which maybe would have been easier in some ways. But now that I know what it's like to love someone the way I love you, to build a life with a true partner, I can't imagine any other version of my story that would make me happy." "I think about that moment in the canyon sometimes," Martha admitted. "The split second when I decided to fire that warning shot instead of riding away. It's frightening to think how easily our whole lives could have gone in a different direction. But they didn't. We're here together with 4 beautiful children and a good life." Daniel pulled her closer. "Whatever forces guided us to that canyon on that particular day, I'm grateful to them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, horses moving in their corral, an owl calling from the trees, the wind rustling through the grass. "Tell me something," Daniel said eventually. "That first day when you came down into the ravine after firing that shot, were you afraid?" "Terrified," Martha admitted, "but also excited. Does that make sense? Like I knew something important was happening even though I didn't understand what yet." "It makes perfect sense." "I felt the same way." He kissed the top of her head. "I looked up and saw you sitting on that horse with the sun behind you and even covered in trail dust and holding a rifle. You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I thought, if I survive this, I need to know her name." Everything else came from that one thought. "I'm glad you survived," Martha said softly. "Me too." Daniel stirred the dying embers of the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. "You know what the best part is? We're not done yet. We've got years ahead of us still, more adventures to have, more memories to make. This story isn't over." "No," Martha agreed, smiling. "It's not over." And it wasn't. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and joys. Peter went to university in Salt Lake City and became a lawyer, following in Elizabeth Morrison's footsteps. Rebecca proved to have her father's musical talent and her mother's determination, eventually performing in that Park City opera house that had seemed so grand. The twins, inseparable as always, took over the running of the ranch as Daniel and Martha aged, ensuring the Foster legacy would continue. There were hard times mixed with the good. They lost Rebecca Holloway in 1895 to pneumonia, a grief that struck deep, but was eased by the knowledge that she had lived to see all her grandchildren grown. Samuel followed 5 years later, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Martha mourned her parents, but found comfort in Daniel's steadfast presence, and in the family they had built together. By the time Utah achieved statehood in 1896, Daniel and Martha Foster were considered pillars of the community. They had lived through the transformation of the frontier, had helped build something lasting in the wilderness. Their story was told to younger generations as an example of courage, love, and perseverance. In the summer of 1900, on their 21st wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at the ranch. More than 200 people attended, representing every corner of the community they had served. There were speeches and toasts, and inevitably, calls for Daniel to sing. He was 66 by then, his hair completely silver, his face deeply lined by sun and wind and years of laughter. But when he picked up his guitar and began to play that ballad he had written so long ago, his voice was still strong and true. And when he sang the words about finding love in unexpected places, about a brave woman who changed his life, Martha knew that every word was still as true as the day he had first sung them. They danced that night under strings of lanterns hung between the trees, moving slowly to music played by their daughter Rebecca and several of her friends. Daniel held Martha close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. 21 years, Daniel murmured into her hair, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the part where you were being chased by armed men, especially that part since it led me to you. Martha laughed, the sound lighter and happier than she had felt in weeks. They had been dealing with a difficult calving season and some concerns about the twins' desire to expand the ranch even further, and laughter had been in short supply lately. But here, now, in Daniel's arms with their family and friends surrounding them, everything felt right. The celebration lasted well into the night, but eventually people began drifting home, offering thanks and congratulations as they departed. The children cleaned up while Daniel and Martha returned to their favorite spot by the fire pit, where so many important moments had occurred over the years. "I was thinking," Daniel said as they settled into their chairs, "maybe it's time we took that trip we always talked about. Go see the ocean before we're too old to travel." "We're not old," Martha protested, though she knew they weren't young anymore either. "We're experienced," Daniel countered with a grin. "But seriously, what do you say? California, the Pacific Coast. We could visit Peter in San Francisco, see some new country." Martha considered this. The twins were more than capable of managing the ranch for a few weeks, and she had to admit the idea was appealing. "All right, let's do it. Let's go see the ocean." They made the trip that autumn, taking the train west through landscapes that alternated between breathtaking and monotonous. Peter met them in San Francisco, now a successful attorney with his own practice and a pretty wife named Alice. Together, they traveled to the coast and stood on the sand watching waves crash against rocky shores. Martha had never seen anything like it, the endless expanse of water stretching to the horizon, the power of the waves, the salt spray in the air. She held Daniel's hand and felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said exactly why she was crying. Joy, maybe. Wonder. Gratitude for having lived long enough to see this miracle. "Worth the wait?" Daniel asked softly. "Worth everything," she replied. They returned to Park City in November, just ahead of the first major snowstorm of the season. The ranch looked even more beautiful to them after weeks away, the familiar mountains and meadows feeling like the truest home. And as they settled back into their routines, Martha reflected that travel was wonderful, but there was something profound about having a place that was completely and absolutely yours. The new century brought changes, some welcome and others less so. Automobiles began appearing on the roads, strange mechanical beasts that frightened the horses. Electricity came to Park City, bringing lights that didn't need oil or candles. The world was modernizing rapidly, leaving behind the frontier era that had defined Daniel and Martha's youth. But some things remained constant. Love, family, the satisfaction of hard work and honest living. The ballad that Daniel had written for Martha was still requested at every gathering, still sung at weddings and anniversaries. It had become part of the community's shared culture, a reminder that even in difficult times, love could flourish and prevail. Daniel's health began to decline in 1908, his heart growing weak. He spent more time in his chair by the fire and less time working the ranch, though he insisted on still teaching his grandson how to train horses properly. Martha stayed close, reading to him when he was too tired to read himself, sitting with him during the long afternoons. On a clear evening in May of 1909, with the wildflowers blooming across the meadows and the last light painting the peaks in gold, Daniel asked Martha to take a walk with him. She worried about him overexerting himself, but something in his expression made her agree. They walked slowly to the spot where they could see the canyon where they had first met, 31 years earlier. Daniel had to stop several times to catch his breath, but he was determined to reach that particular vantage point. "I wanted to say thank you," he said when they finally stood looking out over the landscape that had shaped their lives. "For that warning shot, for your bravery, for every day since then." "Daniel," Martha's voice broke. She knew what he was saying, knew that this was farewell even though he was still standing beside her. "I've had the most wonderful life, Martha, more than I ever dreamed possible, and it's all because you chose courage over caution, justice over safety." He took her hands in his and she felt how cold they were despite the warm evening. "I need you to know that I'm ready. I've lived fully, loved completely, and I have no regrets." "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I'll never be ready to lose you. You won't lose me. I'll be here, in these mountains, in that ballad, in the children and grandchildren we made together." He smiled, and it was the same smile that had captivated her all those years ago. "Promise me you'll keep living, Martha, keep making memories. Keep being the brave, remarkable woman I fell in love with." "I promise," she managed, though tears were flowing freely now. They stood together watching the sun set, Daniel leaning heavily on Martha's shoulder, both of them memorizing this moment. When the stars began to emerge, they walked slowly back to the house, where family waited. Daniel Foster died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, Martha holding his hand. He was 75 years old and had lived a life filled with love, adventure, and purpose. The funeral was attended by hundreds, and at Martha's request, Rebecca sang her father's ballad one last time, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. Martha grieved deeply, but not destructively. She honored her promise to Daniel by continuing to live fully, spending time with her children and grandchildren, maintaining the school she had founded, and keeping the ranch running with the twins' capable assistants. She was present for births and weddings, for graduations and celebrations, a matriarch who was loved and respected by everyone who knew her. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the fire pit where Daniel had sung that ballad so many times, and she would remember the sound of gunshots in a canyon, blue eyes meeting hers in a dusty barn, the feeling of his hand in hers as they faced danger together, the joy in his voice when their children were born, the way he had looked at her on their wedding day and every day after, like she was the most precious thing in the world. The ballad lived on, passed down through generations. Great-grandchildren who had never met Daniel Foster learned the words and the story behind them. The tale of the cowboy and the brave woman became legend, embellished and romanticized, but always rooted in truth. Martha Jean Foster lived to the remarkable age of 91, dying in her sleep in the summer of 1930. She was survived by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the legacy she and Daniel had built. At her funeral, her great-grandson sang the ballad, his young voice carrying the melody that had defined his great-grandparents' love story. Years later, historians studying the development of Park City and the transformation of Utah from territory to state would come across the Foster story in old letters and journals. They would read about a woman who helped expose corruption, about a man wrongly accused who fought for justice, about a love that grew from shared danger into something lasting and profound. And in the telling and retelling, the story took on the quality of myth, a reminder that the Old West was not just about gunfights and gold rushes, but also about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about courage in the face of injustice, about love finding a way even in the hardest circumstances. The Foster Ranch continued to operate for decades, eventually becoming a historic site preserved as an example of 19th-century frontier life. Tourists would walk through the restored buildings and read plaques telling the story of Daniel and Martha Foster, and some would shake their heads in wonder at how different life had been back then. But the ones who read carefully, who studied the letters and journals preserved in the Ranch Museum, would recognize something timeless in the story. The power of a single choice to change a life, the importance of standing up for what's right. The way love, real love, transforms everything it touches. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the wind moved through the valley just right, visitors to the historic site would swear they could hear music drifting from the old ranch house. A guitar playing softly, a man's voice singing an old ballad about finding light in darkness, about a brave woman who changed his world with a single rifle shot, about promises made and kept beneath the endless Utah sky. The ballad that Daniel Foster wrote for Martha Jean Holloway, sung by firelight on their wedding day and countless times after, had become more than just a song. It was a testament to their story, a reminder that even in the roughest country and the hardest times, love could take root and flourish. That 2 souls could find each other against impossible odds and build something beautiful and lasting. And in the end, that was their true legacy. Not the ranch they built, or the children they raised, or the injustice they helped correct, though all those things mattered. Their real legacy was the proof that love was worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth building a life around. That romance was not just pretty words in poetry books, but something real and solid and enduring. The Wild West had been a place of violence and hardship, of dreams pursued and often lost. But it had also been a place where transformation was possible, where people could reinvent themselves, where a cowboy on the run and a shopkeeper's daughter could meet by chance and discover they were meant to find each other. Their story ended, as all stories must. But the ballad remained, carried forward by voices that would never meet Daniel or Martha Foster, but understood instinctively the truth at the heart of their tale. That love, real love, was the greatest adventure of all. That courage came in many forms. That sometimes the most important thing you could do was take a chance on someone when everyone else had written them off. And that sometimes, just sometimes, a single moment of bravery could change everything. The sun set over the Utah mountains the way it always had, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The same sun that had watched Daniel and Martha meet, court, marry, build their lives together, and eventually pass on, leaving behind a story that refused to fade. The land remained, beautiful and harsh and enduring. And somewhere in the wind moving through the canyons, in the rushing of mountain streams, in the whisper of grass in the meadows, the echo of that ballad continued. A cowboy singing by firelight. A woman listening and realizing the words were written for her. A love story that proved the best ones were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth every risk and sacrifice along the way. That was the heart of it, the truth that made their story immortal. And as long as people believed in love, believed in courage, believed in the power of two souls finding each other in the vastness of the world, the Foster story would live on. Not as history exactly, but as something more important, as hope. As proof that happy endings were possible, even in the hardest places, even against the longest odds. The ballad ended, but love never really does. It just transforms, passing from one generation to the next, changing form but never truly disappearing. Daniel and Martha Foster had learned that truth and lived it fully. And in doing so, they had given everyone who heard their story a precious gift. The knowledge that love, true love, was always worth believing in, always worth the risk, always worth the wait. Always worth singing about by firelight, beneath the stars, in a wild country that had long since been tamed but never quite forgotten. Their story was complete, every thread woven together, every promise kept, every moment of joy and sorrow and triumph lived to the fullest. From that first gunshot in a canyon to Martha's peaceful passing surrounded by family, it was a life well lived and a love well earned. And that, in the end, was all anyone could ask for. A chance to love deeply, to live bravely, to leave the world a little better than they found it. Daniel and Martha Foster had done all that and more. Their ballad had ended, but its echo would continue forever.